One of the increasingly bold attempts by anarcho-capitalists to inject themselves within the scope of anarchism is to conflate their ideology as natural successors to the Mutualists, Boston Anarchists, and other individualist variants. Ironically, the attempt to do so has in fact proven otherwise, since the revisionist claims spewed by these right libertarians are only further ammunition to prove that they have no place within the anarchistic perspective, and that anarcho-capitalism is simply another archism. This is in response to a video by Springtime of Nations that is propagated in many right libertarian spaces. As anarcho-capitalists start to misuse famous mutualist theorists, I think it becomes pertinent that mutualists start to defend them from misappropriation on the platform. Mutualism has a history of being eclipsed by larger tendencies and being defined by its competing leftist tendencies, so the fact that this continues on YouTube is not surprising. And no, I am not calling anarcho-capitalists leftists. Since Proudhon is going to be a major topic of discussion as the father of anarchism, let's first review a passage from one of his books that shows us why he's a socialist. Many of these anarcho-capitalists have the gall to claim he isn't because he is in favor of some form of market socialism, but this is simply ludicrous on closer examination. It is otherwise with certain industries which require the combined employment of a large number of workers, a vast array of machines and hands, and to make use of a technical expression, a great division of labor, and in consequence a high concentration of power. In such cases, workman is necessarily subordinate to workman, man dependent on man. The producer is no longer, as in the fields, a sovereign and free father of a family. It is a collectivity. Railroads, mines, factories are all examples. In such cases, it is one of two things. Either the workman is necessarily a piece worker, will be simply an employee of the proprietor capitalist promoter, or he will participate in the chances of loss or gain of the establishment. He will have a voice on the council. In a word, he will become an associate. In the first case, the workman is subordinated, exploited. His permanent condition is one of obedience and poverty. In the second case, he resumes his dignity as a man and citizen. He may aspire to comfort. He forms a part of the producing organization, of which he was before but the slave. As in the town, he forms a part of the sovereign power, of which he was before but the subject. Thus we need not hesitate, for we have no choice. In cases in which production requires great division of labor and a considerable collective force, it is necessary to form an association among the workers in the industry, because without that they would remain related as subordinates and superiors, and there would ensue two industrial castes of masters and wage workers, which is repugnant to a free and democratic society. Apparently, this is unconvincing to the anarcho-capitalist crowd. Proudhon in this quote at length goes into how the capitalist worker paradigm is a form of rulership and should be rejected in favor of a collective association. And now on to Benjamin Tucker. Was he a socialist? Indeed. Tucker was a socialist, as he self-described. His support for mutual credit and disdain for absentee property rights fits him squarely in the socialistic tradition. With the application of mutual credit, it would allow laborers to be in control of their own and end exploitation, which Tucker called usury. Workers would be able to democratize their workplace with buyouts, purchase their own means of production with free credit, and end exploitation, which necessarily eliminates private property. But the common argument among anarcho-capitalists is that capitalism directly equates to markets. This is irreproachably false. If we look closer at both the etymology of the word, how it has been used historically, and its current use, we can clearly see otherwise. Before the term capitalism became a word, people used the term capitalist as a word for the owners of capital. This can be seen in many works at and before the mid-19th century, including What is Property by Proudhon. Capitalism really became a form as we know it when socialist Louis Blanc first used the word in 1850. What I call capitalism, that is to say the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others. And funnily enough, Proudhon also elaborates on his use of the term. The economic and social regime in which capital, the source of income, does not generally belong to those who make it work through their labor. As we can start to see, the origin of the word capitalism does not come from a place of pro-capitalists trying to describe their preferred economic system. It comes from socialists criticizing the status quo of their time. Not only this, but it specifically relates to certain inequalities related to the central characteristics of capitalism, the private ownership of the means of production. With time, more and more refined ideas of what capitalism is have been integrated into what we come to know in modern times as capitalism. These include the profit motive, some form of market system, prices or the cash nexus, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchange, etc. To find some succinct definitions of both capitalism and socialism that cover the point, the book Comparing Economic Systems, A Political Economic Approach gives a great outline that we can use. They write, pure capitalism is defined as a system wherein all the means of production, physical capital, are privately owned and run by the capitalist class for profit, while most other people are workers who work for a salary or wage, and who do not own the capital or the product. We emphasize that no pure capitalist system exists and that capitalist types of economics differ greatly among themselves. Pure socialism is defined as a system wherein all the means of production are owned and run by the government or cooperative non-profit groups. I must stress that there isn't exactly a perfect definition of socialism, as the word is widely used to describe often contradictory ideologies or systems. What we can do is to use a definition that emphasizes what the socialists have in common, and that is socialization of the means of production. Nevertheless, the definitions are useful for analysis and map onto ideology very effectively when describing both capitalism and socialism. The problem with being so simplistic as to only associate capitalism with markets especially exacerbates itself when we cover market socialism, and when analyzing these systems, you would have to move a very substantial portion of who we know as socialists into a category that represents the very thing that they have been trying to remedy, a necessary contradiction. This will show abundantly clear when we are talking about which has been quote mined by Springtime of Nations. With some of the bland aspects of this discussion made clear, we can now work on the constant misinterpretations and misreadings from quotes from some of the most influential anarchists of the 19th and 20th centuries. Springtime of Nations, henceforth referred to as Sun, opens with,
"A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The ideas of anarcho-capitalism do not become any more or less just or correct based on whether you label them as anarchism or not."
For the first and last time, I'm in agreement with Sun. The label of what is and isn't anarchist doesn't actually contribute much to the soundness of ideas, but rather serves as a tool to map the relationship between ideologies. The problem is, anarcho-capitalism does not continue with the same ideological goals as any other anarchists do. That is, the rejection of authority, whether it be from capitalist proprietors, the state, or the church. This is the heart of the issue and must be addressed in its totality. Let it be known that this video isn't exactly a critique of anarcho-capitalism. It is just to combat the revisionist claims that it belongs under the anarchist title and the constant misinterpretations from mutualists.
While the word itself is a matter of semantics, there are certainly actual disagreements of fact about the history that surrounds it. If you ask the average anarcho-communist about this, they'll act like what happened was that anarchism was collectivist from its inception, and everyone agreed with this until the 1950s, when Murray Rothbard randomly started calling himself an anarchist. As I'm going to explain in this video, that is not in fact what happened at all. As we go through the history, it's also going to become very clear that the meaning of words naturally evolves over time, which is something the socialist self-described anarchists consistently fail to grasp when they act as though, "But Proudhon called himself a socialist," is this devastating argument. Ironically, it's often these very same people who will get extremely upset about calling fascists socialist, even though the fascists were using this term much more recently than the individualist anarchists. And if you forget about labels and look purely at economic policy, the views of most fascists were much closer to modern socialism than were the views of someone like Benjamin Tucker were.
This is in fact not what the anarcho-communists have stated, because the ANCOMs have recognized individualist strains of anarchism for a long time. Max Stirner first wrote his book The Unique in His Property in 1844, which basically kickstarted individualism within the anarchist movement. So no one is acting like the anarcho-capitalists are the first individualist anarchists. In fact, a lot of egoists are also communists, so there are in fact even individualists within the group you're trying to criticize. I digress. Although words do evolve over time, they don't like what Sun is suggesting. The definitions shown before are, were, and have been consistent on the demarcation of both capitalism and socialism for a long time. Any ideology attempting to adopt a special vocabulary for what capitalism actually is, based on a market, is necessarily going against how everyone has been using these words for centuries. Not only this, but Proudhon and Tucker both called themselves and were socialists because they believed in forms of socialism, and the fascists are not socialists as they self-ascribed, and often frequently committed violence against socialists and communists. Look at how the Nazis treated the Strasserrites. Fascists described themselves as third positionists because they thought themselves distinct from both capitalism and socialism and seeing it as a false dichotomy. Instead, they proposed a type of corporatism. It does not matter if someone calls themselves one thing if they do not actually believe in what we mean by the term. For example, is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea actually democratic? No, it is not. With closer inspection to the Nazi economy, it cannot be classified as socialist because it does not break the capitalist worker paradigm or get rid of private property. Although the market was dismantled in favor of a planned economy, it has many of the central characteristics of capitalism, which makes it not socialist. It does not matter how close Sun thinks it is based on the superficial observation of the distribution mechanisms. And what is hilarious is how Sun asks us to forget about labels and look purely at economic policy, as if this entire brigade isn't merely a desperate argument about a label.
It wasn't until about 200 years later in France that Pierre-Joseph Proudhon began using the word anarchism to describe his ideology. He was the first person to do this, and the father of anarchism.
The second error about Proudhon is that he first used anarchism to describe his ideology, which is very incorrect. Anarchism is not in any known published or unpublished work by Proudhon. Joseph Dejacque, an anarcho-communist, has been found to use the word inconsistently in his works, and he is also the first person to use libertarian in a political context. What Sun attempts to say, I assume, is that Proudhon is the first self-described anarchist. Proudhon actually called his ideology mutualism, and the reason why most people don't call it anarcho-mutualism is because mutualism most of the time presupposes anarchism because of its connection to Proudhon and subsequent anarchists.
In his 1840 essay, What is Property?, Proudhon defined anarchy as the absence of a master or sovereign, writing, "Neither heredity, nor election, nor universal suffrage, nor the excellence of the sovereign, nor the consecration of religion and of time, can make royalty legitimate. Whatever form it takes, monarchic, oligarchic, or democratic, royalty, or the government of man by man, is illegitimate and absurd." Clearly, no anarcho-capitalist would disagree with this. If you were to ask an ANCAP to define anarchy, they would probably say something very similar: a stateless society.
The interpretation of such a quote is deliberate, as Proudhon makes explicitly clear he opposes the government of man by man, which he calls absurd. The government of man by man is the control of man by others, otherwise known as a master or sovereign, and that is exactly his point. If some form of control happened with the absence of the state, it would be equally as absurd for the same or similar reasons Proudhon makes. Therefore, we must conclude that the anarcho-capitalist vision of anarchy is in fact not very similar, as Proudhon recognized capitalists as a form of rulers that would be necessarily gotten rid of. Returning to our first quote by Proudhon, in capitalist production, the workman is subordinated, exploited. His permanent condition is in one of poverty and obedience.
And yet, the very same collectivist anarchists who so fiercely denounce Rothbardianism tend to be much more willing to accept Proudhon as the father of anarchism. Why is that? Well, essentially it boils down to a statement Proudhon makes in the same essay, in answer to the title of his work: "Property is robbery."
Another bold yet substantially unsupported statement is made by Sun in support of his obviously false thesis. This, I assume, is made because of the usage of Proudhon in his book in a video by Thought Slime about why anarcho-capitalists are not anarchists. Again, this is a major flaw. Proudhon is generally held as the father of anarchism because he both first called himself an anarchist as well as developed what would become the theory of anarchism, connecting oppression from the state, capitalism, and the church into one organized worldview. Ian McKay writes succinctly in Property is Theft, a Pierre-Joseph Proudhon anthology. Proudhon's lasting legacy is his contribution to anarchism. It is little wonder that he has been termed the father of anarchism, for while anarchism has evolved since Proudhon's time, it still bases itself on the themes first expounded in a systematic way by the Frenchman. Indeed, it is hard to imagine anarchism without Proudhon. While Proudhon may not have been the first thinker to suggest a stateless and classless society, he was the first to call himself an anarchist and to influence a movement of that name. This is not to suggest that libertarian ideas and movements had not existed before Proudhon, nor that anarchistic ideas did not develop spontaneously after 1840, but these were not a coherent, named, articulate theory. While anarchism does not have to be identical to Proudhon's specific ideas and proposal, it does have to be consistent with the main thrust of his ideas, in other words, anti-state and anti-capitalism. Thus, collectivist anarchism built on Proudhon, as did communist anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, and individualist anarchism. While none of these later developments were identical to Proudhon's mutualism, each stressed different aspects of his ideas, developing some, changing others. The links of evolution still remain clear. Isn't it strange that some of the people who support Proudhon's views most closely, who read and appreciate his text for what Proudhon has to say, who organize the dossiers in respect to his influence, are never anarcho-capitalists? The only time Proudhon seems to be brought up into the picture in anarcho-capitalist spaces is when they twist very specific sections of text while ignoring the vast majority of his work in order to justify some absurd conclusion that contradicts with Proudhon's main body of work. What I really think is happening in the psychological space of anarcho-capitalists is a knee-jerk reaction to every other anarchist calling them out for rejecting the principles of anarchism, which they then have to post hoc justify on the basis of the colloquial meaning of anarchy. Maybe they just think being called anarchists sounds cool?
On the surface, this does sound quite antithetical to the Rothbardian view, not to mention self-contradictory. I mean, how can property be theft when the concept of theft necessarily presupposes the idea of property? And it gets even more complicated when Proudhon, in a later work entitled Systems of Economical Contradictions, declares property is liberty, while still maintaining the property is theft line. So what's going on here? Does Proudhon think that liberty is theft? Well, not exactly. To answer that question, we first have to understand that Proudhon is French. And there are two very important implications of that. Firstly, it means that he's part of the tradition of continental philosophy. So just like Nietzsche, Hegel, and Foucault, he has a tendency to write somewhat poetically, even at the expense of clarity at times. And secondly, in 19th century France and Europe as a whole, a portion of land was still owned by aristocrats who had acquired their land and therefore their wealth not by homesteading and not by voluntary transactions, but by being part of the state. So property was indeed theft in the straightforward Rothbardian sense, that property at least. That is, it was land stolen from the peasants who worked it by a hereditary class of nobles that formed the medieval state. These landed titles were rightfully abolished in the French Revolution of 1789, but were later partially restored. By the time of the 1840s, when Proudhon wrote What is Property?, French society was again becoming discontent with this state of affairs. So, the property that Proudhon identifies with liberty is not in principle the same as the property he identifies with theft or robbery. But he believed that in practice, the two had become entangled, and the essence of his political ideology, which he named anarchism, was an effort to disentangle the two. At one point in What is Property?, Proudhon makes this explicit, declaring his agreement with another philosopher, Pierre Leroux, in the statement, "There is property and property, the one good, the other bad. Now, as it is proper to call different things by different names, if we keep the name property for the former, we must call the latter robbery, rapine, brigandage. If, on the contrary, we reserve the name property for the latter, we must designate the former by the term possession or some such equivalent. Otherwise, we should be troubled with an unpleasant synonymy." When a classical liberal economist, Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui, wrote to Proudhon saying that it was not really property he wanted to abolish, but the abuse of property, Proudhon basically agreed, saying, Monsieur Blanqui acknowledges that property is abused in many harmful ways. I call property the sum of these abuses exclusively. To each of us, property seems a polygon whose angles need knocking off, but the operation performed, Monsieur Blanqui maintains that the figure will still be a polygon, while I consider that this figure will be a circle. It is kind of strange that he would say this, and then go on to say property is liberty. But this was quite a while before he wrote that essay, Economical Contradictions, so he presumably changed his mind about whether the term property could be salvaged in the interim.
This is one of the main points that Sun tries to make, so forgive me for the long playback. But oh, do capitalists love the property is a liberty line, letting Sean P. Wilbur, one of the foremost translators of Proudhon, a neo-Proudhonian mutualist, historian, and anthropologist, explain the ways that this argument is incorrect is the best way to first approach this. Let's see what he has to say. The next step is to confront Proudhon's explicit anti-capitalism, including the 1840 claim that property is theft. It's obviously a provocative statement, but the various arguments in support of it are clearly laid out in What is Property. So does the video go on to explain that there is some kind of loophole in Proudhon's account of property, his theory of collective force and systemic capitalist exploitation, or perhaps in his argument against the droit d'Aubaine that allows capitalists to evade the critique? Nope. First they tell is that we have to understand Proudhon is French, as if maybe anarchists just haven't got the joke, and then they provide an entirely different explanation for the meaning of Proudhon's claim, never showing any evidence that they understood his actual argument. They then slide, without much explanation, to the question of Proudhon's apparently conflicting claims about property. Capitalists love the property is liberty line, and here, as is so often the case, they claim that the property that Proudhon identifies with liberty is not in principle the same as the property he identifies with theft, but that is very much not the case. When Proudhon really explored the relationship between property and liberty in his posthumously published Theory of Property, the basis of his very limited endorsement of domain there was the fact that property in question was precisely the same. They note two clarifications of Proudhon's use of the term property, his remarks to Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui, and his initial critical comments on the use of the term by Pierre Leroux do indeed leave open the possibility that property that would not be theft for the specific reasons laid out in What is Property and ignored by the makers of the video, but the question of property as a liberty arises in a different context, when we had explicitly reversed his position with regard to Leroux's discursive tactics. Not only does Sun completely evade any actual analysis of Proudhon and his work, he makes staggering theories on what Proudhon means based on the fact that, quote-unquote, Proudhon is French. I am starting to wonder if Sun actually read the book in preparation of this video, and it is very telling that the author only read directly from Anarcho-Capitalist sources when he was creating the video, and ignored the actual subject of discussion. To quickly cover the last point that Sun attempted to make, Proudhon was in fact criticizing property outside of the aristocratic property based on violence. He frequently criticizes farm rent, wage labor, etc. in the book. Not only this, but Sun is also unfamiliar with the system of economic contradictions, where Proudhon's point were that these systems had both good and bad sides, and that property was at the same time liberty and theft. Again, Sun doesn't actually embrace any arguments in What is Property, presumably because they are incompatible with a pro-capitalistic position, although Proudhon came to an idea that some neutered reformation of the property idea should be made as a synthesis is also irrelevant, as the support for any kind of property is not exactly capitalistic. Many anarcho-communists make the distinction between private property and personal property, and would never deny the individual his land, house, and possessions as forms of that personal property. Like Sean says, these arguments are basically laid out in What is Property, which will be the topic for a future video. What Sun has to tackle in order for his arguments to be effective is how Proudhon's arguments aren't against capitalistic private property in order to actually develop a point, and spoiler alert, he doesn't do that either.
But that same year saw the beginning of the rise of another idea, which would become the mortal enemy of Proudhon's anarchism: communism. Although Karl Marx was influenced by Proudhon's What is Property essay, he would come to reject Proudhon's ideas, and he wrote an entire essay attacking him called The Poverty of Philosophy in 1847. The next year, amidst the revolutions, Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. Proudhon clarified his property is theft statement several times, denouncing communism. In 1849, 1 year after the Springtime of Nations and the publication of the Communist Manifesto, Proudhon would publish Confessions of a Revolutionary, where he reflected on his involvement in the revolution and clarified his position somewhat. In this document, he stated, "In my first memoirs, attacking the established order at the front, I said, for example, property is theft. It was a matter of protesting, so to speak, in relief the nothingness of our institutions. I was then not occupied with anything else. Also, in the memoir in which I demonstrated, by A plus B, this stunning proposition, I had to take care to protest against any communist conclusion."
As for Proudhon's quote-unquote anti-communism, there is something pertinent to be made mention. Communism in this area was not like the communism we know today, and this must be dealt with if you want to address the subject in relation to anarcho-communism, which Sun is trying to do, and as Kropotkin states, before and in 1848, the theory of communism was put forward in such a shape as to fully account for Proudhon's mistrust as to its effect upon liberty. The old idea of communism was the idea of monastic communities under the severe rule of elders, or of men of science for directing priests. The last vestiges of liberty and of individual energy would be destroyed if humanity ever had to go through such a communism. Karl Marx is often put into the picture of Proudhon where he really doesn't need to be made mention, and sadly this seems to be another iteration of the issue. The problem with statements like, he would come to reject Proudhon's ideas, is that it doesn't really tell you anything about the big picture between the two, and Marx made many developments off of Proudhon, and there are criticisms in The Poverty of Philosophy that later seemed to be reversed on the side of Marx. As long as we're using individualist anarchists as evidence in this video, Benjamin Tucker wrote on the subject claiming, Proudhon was years before Marx with nearly every link in this logical chain. We stand ready to give volume, chapter, and page of his writings for the historical persistence of class struggle in successive manifestations, for the bourgeoisie's appeal to liberty and its infidelity thereto, for the theory that labor is the source and measure of value, for the laborer's inability to repurchase his products in consequence of the privileged capitalist's practice of keeping back a part of it from his wages, and for the process of the monopolistic concentration of capital and its disastrous results. Speaking of Tucker, he would come to use many theories expounded by Marx to justify his individualism. Not to mention, fighting between anarchists and Marxists is as old as the two have existed. The fact that Proudhon and Marx disagreed is not much of a surprise. Both individualist and communist variants of anarchism both found substantial agreement and disagreement with Marxism long after Proudhon's death. And within Confessions of a Revolutionary, there are many quotes that would debunk any claim that Proudhon was not a socialist, or that his ideas were more close to anarcho-capitalists, but that would exceed the necessary length of this video. Not only this, but right after a quote from Confessions of a Revolutionary that Sun uses, Proudhon literally clarifies his position in a way that contradicts Sun's whole point just previously, and that Proudhon was actually referring to the same type of property in Property is Theft in the System of Economic Contradictions. In the System of Economic Contradictions, after having recalled and confirmed my first definition, I added one entirely contrary, but based on considerations of another order, which could neither destroy nor be destroyed by the first argument. Property is liberty. Property is theft. Property is liberty. These two propositions are equally demonstrated and subsist side by side in the System of Contradictions. I also did the same on each of the economic categories, the division of labor, competition, the state, credit, the community, etc., showing in turn how each of these ideas and consequently how these institutions they generate have a positive and a negative side, how they give rise to a double series of diametrically opposed results, and always I conclude to the necessity of an agreement, conciliation, or synthesis. Property, therefore, appeared here, along with the other economic categories, with its reason for being and its reason for not being, that is, a double-faced element of the economic and social system. Is it too hard to at least read around the quotes you're pulling from, Son? For the quote at hand, Chaudey again makes another articulate response to the misreadings of the quote from Proudhon. In the early 1850s, around the time he summarized his approach in Philosophy of Progress, Proudhon divided his career thus far into critical and constructive periods, with the divide around 1852. I've discussed these periods in an exploratory way in a recent blog post, Margins and Problems, Enter the Anarchist. He didn't set out to found anarchism, and it's probably not accidental that he never used the term. His opposition to systems is well documented in his better-known works, but perhaps it's worth knowing that he wrote, "All these isms aren't worth a pair of boots." He saw community and property as competing tendencies that society would have to eventually evolve beyond, so we first have to recognize that those social forms were being addressed in the early works as very general principles. Then we have to expect that, in rejecting one, Proudhon would take care not to allow people to think that he was choosing the other, and those are probably the recognitions from which to understand Proudhon's anti-communism. A lot of times when looking at Proudhon's anti-communism, it is necessary to look at how he uses the words. In many respects, Proudhon similarly rejected individualism in various instances, which paints an even weirder picture. In many ways, Proudhon is complicated and seemingly self-contradictory at times, and any analysis that doesn't incorporate substantive resources from his work is bound to fail.
Indeed, later, one of Proudhon's American followers, an anarchist named Benjamin Tucker, who will come up later, would clarify Proudhon's position using writing which is somewhat easier to understand on account of his not being French. It will probably surprise many who know nothing of Proudhon, save his declaration that property is robbery, to learn that he was perhaps the most vigorous hater of communism that ever lived on this planet. But the apparent inconsistency vanishes when you read his book and find that by property he means simply legally privileged wealth or the power of usury, and not at all the possession by the laborer of his products. We believe, with Proudhon, that communism is the religion of poverty and slavery. At bottom, it is the majority principle itself, and liberty lives to do it battle.
Chaudey once again saves the day with a great explanation of Tucker's statement. The next point of any significance seems to be Tucker's assertion that Proudhon was perhaps the most vigorous hater of communism that ever lived on this planet. It's a rather over-the-top claim, even for Tucker, and if we want to get a sense of just how much Tucker's own anti-communism may have been coloring his understanding of Proudhon, we only have to look at his translation of What is Property, where he translated communauté not as community, but as communism, for which Proudhon elsewhere used the French communisme. This is, at this point, a time-honored mistake in some circles, but is still a distortion of Proudhon's thought, and if you don't correct it, including accounting for what communism was in the 1840s, it's certainly going to color your reading of the discussion of the common and proper from 1846, etc. So when the video turns to the system of economic contradictions, a notoriously difficult work which remains partially untranslated, it's hard to have much hope that even the minor points are presumably scored by the capitalists are particularly well-founded. As we can see, there is significant, clear, and distinct evidence that part of Tucker's own anti-communism seeped into his translations and characterization of Proudhon. Combine this with both the facts that communism was different in the 1840s and that Proudhon was fighting between tendencies of community and property, and we start to find that the picture is actually radically more nuanced than Sun makes it out to be. What is important about the quote that Sun speaks of is that the subject of usury, which is used by the American individualists very specifically, but will he tell us what it means?
Notice in the first quote that Tucker, like Proudhon, thought that usury, or the charging of interest on loans, shouldn't exist. Isn't that contrary to the views of modern anarcho-capitalists? Well, it is contrary to our predictions for what a stateless society would look like, but not to our basic prescriptions for what such a society should be. In other words, Proudhon and Tucker were not in favor of banning usury by force, but instead thought that it would naturally disappear when the privileges granted by the state were eliminated.
What is conspicuous is that Sun leaves out two-thirds of the picture, and for good reason, because it demands socialist conclusions. Benjamin Tucker explains usury thusly. From Smith's principle that labor is the true measure of price, or as Warren phrased it, that cost is the proper limit of price, These three men made the following deductions: that the natural wage of labor is its product, that this wage or product is the only just source of income, leaving out, of course, gift, inheritance, etc., that all who derive income from any other source abstract it directly or indirectly from the natural and just wage of labor, and this abstracting process generally takes one of three forms: interest, rent, and profit, that these three constitute the trinity of usury, and are simply different methods of levying tribute for the use of capital, that capital being simply stored up labor which has already received its pay in full. Its use ought to be gratuitous, on the principle that labor is the only basis of price, that the lender of capital is entitled to its return intact and nothing more, and that the only reason why the banker, the stockholder, the landlord, the manufacturer, and the merchant are able to exact usury from the labor lies in the fact that they are backed by legal privilege or monopoly, and that the only way to secure labor the full enjoyment of its entire product or natural wage is to strike down monopoly. We see here that Benjamin Tucker actually includes interest, rent, and profit as the trinity of usury. The implications of this put Tucker firmly away from the capitalistic perspective, which is built on profit. Not only this, but he and Proudhon go so far as to claim that it is a form of theft, which is absent in the anarcho-capitalist perspective as well. Tucker again criticizes landlords, manufacturers, stockholders, merchants, and bankers on these grounds, which again is absent from anarcho-capitalist circles. The fact that Tucker or Proudhon wouldn't outright ban usury using some form of state does not actually mean that they didn't want to get rid of these practices. Again, they are anarchists and they use anarchistic methods. As we can so plainly see in the bulk of their works, they were against these practices very much so. Their analyses have extensively explored the effects of usury in society and how to virtually remove it from society. They simply believed having mutual banks and markets would best solve the issue, but were not opposed to violence to reach their goals if they thought it necessary. Sun makes the claim now that because anarcho-capitalists believe different forms of society would emerge with the abolition of the state, then they are essentially the same as these mutualists. This is very silly, and I hope it's for obvious reasons, as it deliberately ignores the prescriptions Proudhon and Tucker make about an anarchist society that contradict the anarcho-capitalist perspective, and then he chooses to overemphasize the market side of their mutualism. As we've seen before, Proudhon makes explicit prescriptions for what parameters an economic system should have to be put in place, and that is to associate what must be associated, and to oust the bourgeois from reigning as a caste of masters above the proletariat. To eliminate the practice of exploitation, hierarchy, and usury is the prescription of the mutualists, but this is not a prescription in anarcho-capitalism. And this makes it so the argument that the prescriptions are akin is unquestionably false. As for Tucker, the introduction of mutual banking and the abolition of the land monopoly are both prescriptive to his system as he advocated for them consistently. The abolition of the land monopoly would mean that tenants couldn't be forced to pay rent, something the anarcho-capitalists seem to reject based on their notion of what property should be. And going on about property, mutualists and individualists compared to anarcho-capitalists have wildly different interpretations on property in general and are incompatible with the perspective of the anarchists. I would also like to mention that Sun is suggesting that mutualism doesn't contradict the basic prescriptions of anarcho-capitalism, and that is true to some degree. Anarcho-communism also doesn't violate this prescription, since it advocates the voluntary formation of communes, and as you can see, this argument doesn't hold water because it is basically meaningless and ignores the actual point that we're discussing. Proudhon and Tucker both oppose these forms of exploitation, and anarcho-capitalists do not, and that is a very big difference that cannot be overstated. We use means to get to ends, and Tucker did not believe in a free market for the sake of a free market. He wanted to use it to achieve socialism, which is diametrically opposed to the aims of Ancaps. The anarcho-capitalists simply need to recognize that just because they plan to ostensibly abolish the state doesn't include them as anarchists if they reject the fundamental principles of anarchism for the sake of capitalism.
In his debate with Frederick Bastiat on the topic, Proudhon clarified, "Interest is neither a crime nor an offense," and went on to say, "This fundamental denial of interest does not destroy, in our view, the principle, the right, if you will, which gives birth to interest, and which has enabled it to continue to this day in spite of its condemnation by secular and ecclesiastical authority. So that the real problem before us is not to ascertain whether usury per se is illegitimate, in this respect we are of the opinion of the Church, nor whether it has an excuse for its existence. On this point, we agree with the economists. The problem is to devise a means of suppressing the abuse without violating the right, a means, in a word, of reconciling this contradiction.
In the 1840s, Proudhon seemed to be especially interested in looking for the reasons underlying the current systems, and this seems to be a point where Proudhon uses the guise of reformist-esque rhetoric while still maintaining his underlying radicalism. In particular, we can still see his opposition to usury as he maintains with the Church that it is illegitimate. As painful as it is to watch it repeated, it becomes painful again to repeat it in response. The Anarcho-Capitalists do not see usury as illegitimate. For this quote in Proudhon's seemingly reformist attitude, Sean explains. Particularly in the 1840s, Proudhon spent a lot of time looking for both the salvageable rationales and the fatal flaws in the implementations. So we find him talking in what seems like very reformist language while still proposing very radical changes in practice.
Anyway, once again, this was later put in a more straightforward language by Benjamin Tucker in his response to Auber and Herbert, a British thinker who first coined the term voluntarist. Herbert did not identify as an anarchist, but his positions were very close to those of Proudhon and Tucker, and he often contributed to Tucker's magazine. Tucker said, Auber and Herbert, in his paper Free Life, asks me how I justify a campaign against the right of men to lend and borrow. I answer that I do not justify such a campaign, have never attempted to justify such a campaign, do not advocate such a campaign. In fact, I am ardently opposed to such a campaign. In turn, I ask Mr. Herbert how he justifies his apparent attribution to me of a wish to see such a campaign instituted. It is true that I expect lending and borrowing to disappear, but not by any denial of the right to lend and borrow. On the contrary, I expect them to disappear by virtue of the affirmation and exercise of a right that is now denied, namely, the right to use one's own credit, or to exchange it freely for another's, in such a way that one or the other of these credits may perform the function of a circulating medium, without the payment of any tax for the privilege. He also says basically the same thing in response to another reader of his magazine Liberty. No anarchist disputes that it is perfectly legitimate to borrow on such terms as may be agreed upon in the free market. The complaint of anarchism is that the market is not free, and that the transactions effected therein are necessarily tainted with injustice. At present, if the young man borrows, whether of the cook or of the bank, the terms of the contract are dictated to his disadvantage by means of a legal privilege or monopoly enjoyed by the bank.
Benjamin, as an anarchist, does not expect any form of state to ban such a practice, and instead utilizes anarchistic and market methods to achieve his ends. Just as any other anarchist doesn't endorse any immoral or illegitimate practices that aren't explicitly banned in an anarchist society, we do not expect an anarcho-cop to enforce the limits of usury on credits. With the application of mutual banking and the abolition of the money monopoly, credit would necessarily drop to cost, and that limit of cost price that Tucker advocated for would end usury in credits. To point to the absurdity of Sun's claim, this is like calling anarcho-capitalists market socialists, because worker cooperatives could still be able to theoretically compete in their markets. It just ignores the crux of the issue entirely. About Auber and Herbert, it is noted that Tucker was rather fond of Herbert, but there are some important distinctions that need to be made clear. Herbert was not immune from criticism from the individualist Americans. There are some very clear divisions between them, and he received it for his support of profit, rent, and the general inequalities associated with his classical liberalism. Individualist anarchist Victor Yaros criticized Herbert for such things in Liberty. A lot more evidence than this is going to be needed to support the claim that Herbert's ideology was anywhere close to Proudhon's. Even though Tucker believed systems of voluntary taxation would lead to anarchy, it doesn't actually mean that Herbert was an anarchist, as he still supported capitalistic institutions that are directly antagonistic to the principles of anarchy.
Like many modern anarcho-capitalists, Proudhon called for a controlled process of political reform and transition to statelessness after the revolutionary capture of the state. In his essay, The State, Its Nature, Object, and Destiny, Proudhon clarifies that this process should involve market reforms and tax reforms, and denounces the idea of soaking the rich and increasing the overall tax burden.
Sun makes the claim that there is some connection between anarcho-capitalism and Proudhon based on the idea of reformism into anarchy. While Proudhon did offer reforms that could have been made, he was a politician at one point after all, he also came to embrace elements of propaganda by the deed which later took precedence in anarchism. Sean again elaborates. Proudhon himself vacillated between an emphasis on persuasion and an insurrectionary streak. What he had actually proposed as his last will and testament at one time was a proposal for a society of avengers, which would engage in violent propaganda by deed with his blessings, once his life work of attempts at peaceful change had failed.
The Revolution of February raised two leading questions. One economic, the question of labor and property. The other political, the question of government or the state. On the first of these questions, the socialistic democracy is substantially in accord. They admit that it is not a question of the seizure and division of property, or even of its repurchase. Neither is it a question of dishonorably levying additional taxes on the wealthy and property-holding classes, which, while violating the principle of property recognized in the Constitution, would serve only to overturn the general economy and aggravate the situation of the proletariat. The economic reform consists, on the one hand, in opening usurious credit to competition, and thereby causing capital to lose its income. In other words, in identifying in every citizen to the same degree the capacity of the laborer and that of the capitalist. On the other hand, in abolishing the whole system of existing taxes, which fall only on the laborer and the poor man, and replacing them all by a single tax on capital as an insurance premium. By these two great reforms, social economy is reconstituted from top to bottom, commercial and industrial relations are inverted, and the profits, now assured to the capitalist, return to the laborer. Competition, now anarchical and subversive, becomes emulative and fruitful. Markets no longer being wanting, the working man and employer, intimately connected, have nothing more to fear from stagnation or suspension. A new order is established upon the old institutions abolished or regenerated. We affirm then, and as yet we are alone in affirming, that with the economic revolution no longer in dispute, the state must entirely disappear.
You'll notice in this passage that Proudhon refers to socialistic democracy as agreeing with him when he says that the property of the rich in general should not be seized or faced with increased taxation. That's interesting, as it's certainly not the position of self-described socialists today. This is reflective of the fact that at this point, socialism was a relatively new term, the meaning of which was very much in flux. Proudhon used the term socialist to signal a general allegiance to the lower social classes, and a belief that if his ideas were implemented, they would be better off, which is not how the term would later be used.
What is obvious to any anarcho-communist must be said, and that is that socialism is not when you tax the rich. Social democracy may stand for increased taxation, but socialism, as we have shown, is social control of the means of production. What Sun is referring to is a quote of Proudhon surrounding some type of reform. He says, "They admit that it is not a question of the seizure and division of property or even of its repurchase. Neither is it a question of dishonorably levying additional taxes on the wealthy and property-holding classes, which, while violating the principle of property recognized in the Constitution, would serve only to overturn the general economy and aggravate the situation of the proletariat." Sun seems to miss the actual word choice used by Proudhon and instead has attempted to look at the general word flow of the message. Notice the word dishonorably used by Proudhon. It isn't exactly saying that it is wrong per se, only that it violates what is in the Constitution. Since this is taking place directly after the failed revolution of 1848, what is more likely being meant is that it would be a dishonorable to the principles of the revolution and to the proletariat to simply introduce an additional property tax, and as he put it, would aggravate the situation of the proletariat. Proudhon simply doesn't oppose this concept on forms of libertarian capitalistic propertarian grounds like Sun implies he does. We know this since he suggests a single tax on capital immediately thereafter. Although socialism was rapidly evolving and Proudhon uses it in a very specific context and way, as we'll soon see, there's no debunk from Sun on why it doesn't meet the qualifications of socialism set in the modern day and set by socialists and how everyone uses the word, so this discussion is essentially irrelevant.
He also identified socialism with the idea that some things can and should be collectively owned, so long as this is achieved voluntarily. On the subject, he wrote, "If by socialism you mean social right as opposed to individual right, I accept this system as an integral part of the whole system of humanity. But if you intend to give it predominance over liberty, I deny it. That is communism.
For the full quote, Socialism. Every word and subject has several recognized meanings. If understood as a theory of society or social science, I claim it. If understood as a party that affirms a social science and the necessity of reforming society in accordance with that social science, I am a part of it. This is what we have affirmed in 1848. If by socialism you mean social right, as opposed to individual right, I accept the system as an integral part of the whole system of humanity. But if you intend to give it predominance over liberty, I deny it. That is communism. This is how Pierre Leroux understood it. In this way, he has, in turn, attacked and defended it. What Sun fails with this quote is to show that Proudhon thought that socialism was only to collectivize production voluntarily, as this is not exactly what the quote is about. But Sun is correct about one thing, yet still only half, and that is that socialism underwent lots of alterations as a term in this era since it was brand new. This is why Proudhon addressed the subject here, as a response to Pierre Leroux, who coined the term, as his message of what he means by calling himself a socialist. In no way does this mean that Proudhon's positions don't fall under the scope of socialism as we know it today, as we have thus far shown and is known today. The part that Sun seems to want to leave out is that communism was also a term that was consistently shifting in its usage at and beyond this time frame. What can be inferred from this direct quotation is that Proudhon wanted to synchronize the aspects of individuality and community, and that the community should not triumph over the individual. But in a broader sense, communism as we know it today was simply not there. Even in the time of Karl Marx, the distinguishing between socialism and communism wasn't really a consecrated practice.
In my earlier video on the origins of fascism, I called Proudhon a libertarian socialist for simplicity's sake, but he never actually used that term for himself. In fact, the only person who was calling himself a libertarian in Proudhon's day was the first person to do so, Joseph Dejacque. Somewhat ironically, Dejacque was a bitter rival of Proudhon's and denounced his individualism.
Although not what he called himself, it is still fair to call Proudhon a libertarian socialist, since mutualism is classified under that umbrella term as a form of libertarian socialism. Looking into Dejacque, it is hard to see what Sun means by denounced his individualism, because I couldn't locate what he was referring to. The best approximation I can assume is that Dejacque believed in fulfilling people's needs rather than securing them their individual products, which Sun soon goes over, in a way that doesn't really add anything to the conversation, might I add.
Mashallah, it remained a fringe idea for the rest of Dejacque's life. Neither his communistic views nor his use of the word libertarian would catch on. Dejacque's magazine, The Libertarian, would only run for 3 years from 1858 to 1861.
Whether the word libertarian would catch on is irrelevant to the discussion, but no, libertarian did see use as a synonym for anarchism for the later part of the 19th century and earlier part of the 20th century, until it was appropriated by liberals. In the Spanish anarchist revolution, the CNT-FAI called their system a form of libertarian communism, and Benjamin Tucker also used the word to describe his version of socialism at times.
And indeed, as long as Proudhon lived, the anarchist movement as a whole would remain relatively close to his views. Even those self-described anarchists who had some disagreements with Proudhon often did not disagree with him in a direction that modern anarcho-communists would approve of. For example, take Anselm Bellagegarrigue. He was the author of the first anarchist manifesto ever written in 1850. This document is the original source of the often quoted phrase, "Anarchy is order, government is civil war." This phrase would later be represented by the famous symbol of the A inside the O, meaning anarchy and order. What's interesting about Bellagegarrigue is that he was actually not an anarchist by modern definitions, in that he believed the state should exist in a minimal form, only protecting the lives and property of citizens from domestic criminals and foreign armies. As the Anarchist Manifesto states, there are only 2 points among the people on which no divergence of opinion can exist. 2 points on which converge the good sense of all parties, irrespective of details. Those 2 points are the repression of crime against the person and against property, and the defense of the territory. So, well, why should we seek the guardian spirit of a government outside this reservoir of the common aspirations of all? Why should we permit the introduction of a dose of individual attachments to this potion prepared for the health of all?
I assume this is just a sad attempt to dunk on anarchists by claiming our symbolism comes from a minarchist, but it is rather silly. Bellagegarrigue was an individualist in a very similar way that Stirner was. The quote, "sun is pulling," does not prove that Bellagegarrigue was a minarchist, since it is a merely set up for a larger section in his larger body of critique of the state and democracy. I can find no other source reaffirming this claim that he was a proponent of minarchism. Here are two quotes that should dispel any suspicion that he was otherwise. Every individual who in the current state of affairs drops a paper into the ballot box to choose a legislative authority or an executive authority is, perhaps not wittingly, but at least out of ignorance, maybe not directly, but at least indirectly, a bad citizen. I repeat what I have been saying and take back not a single syllable of it. A government whose powers are thus defined cannot excite the discontent of anyone without at the same time being condemned by everyone, since it only occupies itself precisely with issues on which everyone is in agreement. Whether it acts well or whether it acts badly, it has no opposition. The sanction of its acts is in the conscience of all. To protect a government from revolutions, it must not be permitted to interfere in the real lives of its citizens. It must not be allowed to be able to touch the instincts, the tastes, the private interests of the citizens, because these instincts, these tastes, these interests are varied and changing, while the rules of an administration are uniform and fixed. A democratic government must remain forever in social abstraction. And this second quotation is talking about the exact same hypothetical I previously mentioned, the quote-unquote common ground, the minarchist government that Bellagegarrigue introduces in Sun's quote, and he denounces as a social abstraction.
That's right. The anarchy symbol that communists use today comes from a quote by a literal minarchist. The most important implication of the fact that Bellagegarrigue held this position is that it showed that early anarchists believed that private property should, in principle, be protected, even by the state, if they thought it necessary.
He didn't even mention private property, only property in the most vague terms that most probably means some form of personal property and possessions, and thereafter he even concluded that the minarchist state is just a social abstraction. This doesn't even follow from the quote, "Sun selected out." Again, this doesn't mean anything, but I'm still just confused and baffled why it is necessary to misinterpret all these anarchists, especially when it doesn't relate to the thesis. If Sun and other anarcho-capitalists were actually the inheritors of their values, you wouldn't need to feel the need to twist their politics. Sun continues to give a history of what happened to the Proudhonians within the First International, coming to talk about Chaudey and Bakunin. One wrong thing that he claims is that Chaudey was supposed to be the next caliph of anarchism.
Unfortunately, that would not be the last time that Proudhonists would cross paths with the Blanquists. Before Proudhon died, he had designated his most trusted disciple, a man named Gustave Chaudey, as the executor of his estate, and basically expected him to succeed him as the next caliph of anarchism.
This is incorrect, as Sean explains. Chaudey was actually one of several people named as literary executors. He was among the most active and faithful and deserves to be remembered more favorably than he generally has been, but hand-picked successor he was not. This is another point where we have to remember that Proudhon was not writing for an anarchist movement of the sort that we tend to envision, but also recognize that, after Proudhon's death, in the context of changing political conditions, the various individuals who could claim political descent from Proudhon simply did not agree on the way forward. There was a lot of conflict among them, and arguably none of them was particularly faithful to Proudhon's larger project, which was in large part lost to the anarchist movement. The proclamation that Gustave Chaudey was in any way supposed to spearhead the anarchist movement seems to be another attempt to act like quote-unquote communists stole our name. To act like collectivist Bakunists suddenly hijacked anarchism when Chaudey was actually the real successor of Proudhon's movement is simply another absurdity that is unsupported by this overbloated video.
That sounds pretty important. So, why has basically no one heard of Chaudey? Well, it has to do with both the Blanquists and an anarchist you might have heard of, Mikhail Bakunin. Although he was never personally close with Proudhon, he was influenced by him quite a bit, to the point that he self-identified as an anarchist, although he was certainly influenced by Karl Marx as well. Bakunin was a pan-Slavic nationalist and was inspired by property norms of the Russian peasantry, which were more collectivist and communal than those of Western Europe. He once criticized Proudhon's individualism, writing, "How ridiculous are the ideas of the individualists of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau school and the Proudhonian mutualists, who conceive society as the result of free contract of individuals, absolutely independent of one another, and entering into mutual relations only because of the convention drawn up among men. As if these men had dropped from the skies, bringing with them speech, will, original thought. As if they were alien to anything of the earth, that is, anything having social origin."
Although not explicitly a flaw, it is misleading to call Bakunin a nationalist. Let it be known that Bakunin was only a nationalist early in his political career, and he worked closely to becoming an anarchist soon thereafter. In fact, he later rejected the nationalistic character of Marx in his work Marxism, Freedom in the State. This quote can be misleading, especially to people who aren't anarchists, such as Anarcho-Capitalists, for example. So here's an explanation of the relationship between Bakunin and Proudhon. Bakunin was not always a positive force in all this. He cribbed a good deal from Proudhon's mature works. His Invisible Dictatorship was almost certainly a variation on Proudhon's Society of Avengers, and his invocation of collective force in that context was almost certainly not an accident. But he somehow misunderstood Proudhon's philosophical thought enough to proclaim him a metaphysician, and sided with Marx. At least some of the time, in the fight over scientific socialism, Proudhon wasn't an individualist any more than he was an idealist. He was in many ways the theorist par excellence of the collective aspects of society, but he didn't live long enough to debate those issues in the context of the international, so the conflicts between various more or less unfaithful disciples have shaped our sense of his thought. Again, Proudhon shouldn't be characterized as a radical individualist. His politics are not that clear-cut for reasons provided hitherto. A lot of what we know about Proudhon and his mutualism is shaped through the lens of his opposition and his more or less unfaithful disciples, as Sean calls them, and ironically, Sun is continuing this trend with the video.
As Proudhon grew older, he made his views on property clearer and clearer, and not in a way Bakunin liked. On his deathbed, Proudhon would declare, "I protest that in criticizing property, or rather the whole body of institutions of which property is the pivot, I never meant either to attack the individual rights recognized by previous laws, or to dispute the legitimacy of acquired possessions, or to instigate an arbitrary distribution of goods, or to put an obstacle in the way of the free and regular acquisition of properties by bargain and sale, or even to prohibit or suppress by sovereign decree land rent and interest on capital. I think that all these manifestations of human activity should remain free and optional for all. I would admit no other modifications, restrictions, or suppressions of them than naturally and necessarily result from the universalization of the principle of reciprocity and of the law of synthesis which I propound. This is my last will and testament. I allow only him to suspect its sincerity, who could tell a lie in the moment of death."
This is again one of the most blaringly wrong proclamations made in this video. Sean again has the correct source and context for this quote. This was not, as the video claimed, a deathbed declaration, but instead part of the proposal for the Bank of the People early in 1849, still in its critical period. This is part of the work generally collected under the title The Solution to the Social Problem, from the period when Proudhon hoped to eliminate exploitation through mutual associations, including the mutual credits associations that are best known. It was the kind of reformism that still got people imprisoned, sent to penal colonies, exiled, and in some instances dead as a result of all that. Proudhon was still walking a fine line between proposing really radical change and meeting the various legal attacks he faced. So, again, we find him saying radical things in language that takes pains to seem to play the game. He was probably writing his legal defense in the books at the point. So, for example, this is part of the same section of the works on mutual credit. What I say of property, I say of every political and religious institution as well. My sole aim in passing through the crucible of criticism the different parts of the social structure has been to discover, by long and laborious analyses, yet higher principles, whereof the algebraic formula is announced in the treatise. So this is critique. Proudhon, as an isolated radical, couldn't pretend to do much else, but is at the same time a ruthless critique of all that exists, and the fact that, for at least a while, his actual last will and treatment. So this is critique. Proudhon, as an isolated radical, couldn't pretend to do much else, but it is at the same time a ruthless critique of all that exists, and the fact that, for at least a while, his actual last will and testament was supposed to be a work advocating leaderless resistance to capitalism and governmentalism through carefully targeted assassinations and debate from the witness stand, essentially the model of propaganda by deed in the late 19th century, is just a delicious extra reminder of just how off the mark this video really is. Notice that the quote does not explicitly deny his previous critiques, endorse property or usury or anything of the sort. He does not contradict himself, but is, at most, allowing these venues of human interaction to happen in a free and voluntary society after the revolution. Either that, or to have society move towards a synthesis. Again, this should be made in the context of all his other critiques, which the video fails to do, and which were antagonistic to such exploitative activities. Just for example, in abolishing rent and interest, the last vestiges of old-time slavery, the revolution abolishes at one stroke the sword of the executioner, the seal of the magistrate, the club of the policeman, the gauge of the exciseman, the erasing knife of the department clerk, all those insignia of politics which young liberty grinds beneath her heel. Since there is no evidence that Proudhon denied his previous critiques of property, we must conclude the most charitable interpretation for Sun is that Proudhon was either saying that people shouldn't be prevented from non-coercively choosing to do these activities, and that there would be other ways to get rid of the exploitative nature of those activities, but probably more realistically, Proudhon was simply writing a testament that would save him from being imprisoned, executed, etc. The latter interpretation would seem to make more sense, given the context of the quote and the context in his other works. Remember that Proudhon's radicalism often got him trouble with the law since he published What is Property, because he was a radical for his time and not a capitalist like Sun is trying to make him to be. In this video there is so much wrong that I will have to finish it with a sequel in order to cover the magnitude of errors that Sun presents. Even then, I doubt it will fully encapsulate the scope of ineptitude, and may require additional debunks over content I've actually already debunked to fully get into the how many reasons this video is a historical dumpster fire. I would like to make videos exploring Proudhon and Tucker more closely, but before I started those projects I thought it was necessary to dispel the misconceptions that these figures are capitalists. This video has been particularly trending for the last few months, and it seems like anarcho-capitalists haven't got the point yet. Hopefully this digestible video should either clear this up, or at least be made easily spammable in their chat rooms as a response to the video. Anyways, thank you for watching, and subscribe to my channel, Hades the Mutualist, if you are interested in more content.